Hi, welcome. So I think a few more have joined us, so we're going to kick off. So welcome to our Outside In Edge webinar today. Your panelists speaking, it's Hannah Nascimento, so I'm the Director of Consultancy and Communications here at Salterbaxter, and I'm joined by my colleague Hugh Maggs, who's our Director of Strategy. Thank you very much for joining us. Just a couple of housekeeping questions or elements. If you would like to ask us a question, and we absolutely encourage that you do, there is a Q&A function either at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen, depending on your system. Please do drop any questions to us. And what we're going to do is run through some thoughts, initial thoughts, first of all, and then we will answer some questions at the end. Just to let you all know as well, this is being recorded, and we will share not only a link to this recording, but also some of the insights that we gathered during our event back in October with you all. So if you miss anything, you can go back to the recording and obviously look at the insights as well. I think that's everything from a housekeeping perspective. If you would like to tweet during this webinar, the hashtag is #directions18. And again, obviously, we encourage you to do so. Brilliant. Oh. I can't see it. So obviously we will just run through a very brief introduction to Salterbaxter for those of you who don't know us. Then I will hand over to my colleague Hugh, who will run us through some sort of scene setting and the changing shape of engagement, as well as some real world examples that were gathered during our event in October. And then we'll finish up with me with some sort of tips and tricks of how to get started in this space. So for those of you who don't know, Salterbaxter is a leading sustainability agency working in a creative way across sort of sustainability and brand purpose challenges for some of the world's biggest and best and innovative businesses and brands. We work cross-sector, cross-issue, ranging, as you can see, from sort of energy and mining to FMCGs to agriculture, commodities-based businesses, apparel, food, and probably everything that you can think of in between. We've been around for 20 plus years. We only work in sustainability, and we are internationally focused. Here at Salterbaxter, we deliver or offer an end-to-end sustainability service. So within the teams, we have specialist sustainability consultants, expert planning and insight specialists who work alongside a really great team of creatives and digital expertise, as well as a very strong offering in client service and project management. So we do offer an end-to-end service, which we think gives us the best offer that we can give to our clients and keeping it all under one roof. Broadly speaking, what we do falls into two main camps, so strategy engagement and then communications and activations. So the services that we offer under strategy engagement range from sort of materiality to strategy definition to strategic frameworks to goals and target setting to roadmaps to very in-depth and robust stakeholder engagement, whether that be on sort of strategies as a whole or specific. And then the tail end of much of that work is obviously in communications and activation. So how do we make sustainability come to life for different audiences? How do we make it engaging? How do we make it drive behavior change or different appetites and ambitions within business, inside and outside of businesses? Narrative development, and still a part of our business is in the sort of integrated and sustainability reporting space. Obviously, with such a broad team of specialists and different consultants with different areas of expertise, we really pride ourselves on our thought leadership, and we deliver our thought leadership under our sort of directions brand, which is what we are working under today. So back in October, we ran our annual Sustainable Business Forum, which this year focuses on stakeholder engagement. We run that event every year, and every year it picks up on a different trend or a different challenge or a different issue that we see as impacting and keeping our clients up at night. We supplement that annual business forum with a range of different thought leadership supplements that we put out throughout the year, and many of which you can find on our website. They are a good read. So that's a sort of whistle-stop tour really of Salterbaxter.
Brilliant, thank you, Hannah. So welcome everyone. As Hannah mentioned, I'm Hugh Maggs. I'm the Strategy Director here at Salterbaxter. So we're going to spend the next sort of 25 minutes, half an hour, just running through some of the key themes and reflections that came out of the event in October. And then building on top of that, I guess, some of the insights and reflections that we have from some of the work we do with our clients. And I'm going to start just by setting the scene a little bit. And I think the first thing to say is, when it comes to stakeholder engagement, there's been a definite gap over the years between the theory and the practice. There's obviously a vast amount of literature out there, both academic and practitioner on stakeholder engagement, and the role that it can play in effective business management and value creation. But the reality is, for the most part, that most large companies are a long way from this as an operating reality. And there are some clear reasons for this gap between theory and practice, not least because it represents a really major shift in how business is done. That said, we are seeing a big shift in direction, and certainly that was the consensus among the group that we convened in October in Amsterdam. A shift to a far more intentional approach to engagement and collaboration with stakeholders, one that's much more targeted on outcomes, and when done well, can deliver real benefits both for business and for society. So we're going to talk through a little bit about what we mean by intentional engagement. But before we go there, I think it's probably worth just spending a couple of minutes reminding ourselves of where stakeholder engagement has evolved from. So the concept of stakeholder engagement is very much rooted in CSR. It was first codified, I think, by probably accountability in operational terms at least, and their release of their AA 1000 engagement standard. And traditionally has been a process by which an organization involves people who are either affected by or can influence the decisions of a company. So very much accountability driven. And from a company perspective, it's very much been about managing risk, and in particular, reputational risk. And I think it's fair to say that that's played an incredibly important role in the evolution of CSR and sustainability as a corporate practice. Because in the aggregate, I think it's encouraged a far more widespread interaction between stakeholders in the corporate world over time. But that's in the aggregate. Far too often we've seen companies traditionally undertaking dialogues with stakeholders that have all too often simply been show and tells, an opportunity to tell some important stakeholders that a responsible business the company is, and to profile some recent initiatives or milestones. Now, the better ones allow stakeholders to share their voices openly, and the company will listen. But the intention is by and large the process, to demonstrate through having some form of dialogue that a company is inclusive, that it's open, that it's a responsible citizen. So a process undertaken more for the sake of doing it rather than for achieving a specific outcome. And I think the reality is that for most companies, for many companies, that remains the approach. But as I say, we have started to see this shift. So what's changed? What's changed since AA 1000 was launched back in 1999? And the answer, of course, is a lot has changed. And so we thought it would be worth sharing a few of the wider forces that we think have been shaping the world of stakeholder engagement in the last decade or so. The first of those is the speed with which company behaviors and incidents can be amplified. So today, in today's operating environment, disputes about company operations and activities can be adopted and amplified very quickly by civil society organizations and even by individual citizens. And these groups are becoming increasingly mobilized. That changes the dynamic of the relationship between business and society quite significantly. The second, I think, is a growing recognition that actually pervasive environmental and social issues are much more than just reputational issues. Whether it's water, whether it's commodities, whether it's skills shortages, there's a growing recognition in many boardrooms and increasingly in the investor community that across a number of different sectors, there are some very real market-based risks emerging. Many of those require collective action to understand and collective action to address. The third is a bit more focused on the supply chain. So we've obviously seen globalization of supply chains in recent decades. That's driven improved efficiency, it's reduced cost, but it's also resulted on some quite severely embedded problems around working conditions, around environmental degradation. And as stakeholder and consumer concerns have grown, most large corporates have created programs to assess and influence the behavior of their suppliers. But we're now starting to see a shift towards more collaboration, both collaboration between major corporates that operate across supply chain boundaries and between companies and their suppliers. Now, of course, the flip side of these risks is that they also present business opportunities. Opportunities for companies to create value by either opening up new market share or entering into new markets entirely, both by embracing technology and business model innovation. And some of the collaborations we see today around the innovation space have a huge potential. So, for example, in sustainable transport solutions, we're seeing the likes of ICT companies and automotive manufacturers working closely with city officials and transport buyers to develop new models of transport. The fifth force is the marked shift that we're seeing today in terms of the boundaries between government, civil society, and business. So with the rise of multi-stakeholder initiatives, of which today there are many, which, by the way, have often been driven by leading businesses, that has in turn increased the expectation on companies in general to play a more proactive role in partnering up. And then finally, I think just the speed with which issues in general are now evolving. So for example, just in the last year, the number of EU legal documents on plastics has gone from 4 to over 50. And it's now predicted that 14% of value on average could be wiped out from the stock price of plastic packaging companies in the next few years. So that's really, really quick pace of change just within 1 year. And at the same time, leading companies are also raising the bar when it comes to corporate practice. In the last 18 months, we've seen science-based targets become something that over 400 companies have now committed to. So more than ever before, companies face competitive pressures to integrate new ideas and approaches. And the closer companies are to the conversation, the more agile they can be in responding. And only by having a seat at the table can they really influence how issues and agendas evolve. So those are 6 of the kind of key forces that we see. They're by no means all of them. But how are these forces then changing the shape of engagement? And this next framework is one that I developed along with my colleagues at the consultancy Sustainability when I was there. And it's actually quite a useful way of summarizing that shift that we're seeing. So as I mentioned, back, if you like, in the dark ages, companies would literally just provide information to external stakeholders. That was driven by compliance. It was very much about managing risk. And as is implied by the nature of informing, it was very much one way. We've then, as I mentioned, seen a shift towards more open engagement, still very much driven by accountability, still very much the focus of CSR, but more interactive, often more systemic in terms of the nature of the dialogue, and often convening a range of different stakeholders. So where we are today is where the optimal form of engagement is really around collaboration. The key driver is about transforming markets and systems, and the core focus is innovation, and that's a really interesting development. And we mean here innovation in its broadest sense, so both to solve difficult challenges and to open up new opportunities for growth. And in many ways, that actually reflects the increasing connection between collaboration and innovation that we see in business at large. So if we think about Silicon Valley as an example, where you have tech workers, entrepreneurs, investors, researchers at nearby universities, all living and working in close proximity, and that's allowed new technologies and ideas to really rapidly evolve, develop, and refine, often with some really spectacular results. And we're just starting to see some of the seeds of that sort of co-creation network emerging around sustainability as well. And although very much in its nascent stage, that is a really exciting development. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. I think another important thing just to mention on this model is that although it describes collaboration as the core approach on the right-hand side, actually effective consultation and engagement is still a really key skill. Often it's there as a key skill to form consensus. Often then that leads to collaboration, but not to underestimate the importance of open dialogue and consultation. Now, of course, this has implications for companies, and it's not necessarily easy or immediate thing to suddenly turn into an organization that's collaborating across multiple boundaries. And the first of these implications I've just talked through, that the purpose of engagement is changing in the face of a range of different drivers. But that has 2 important knock-on impacts. First of these is who you engage with. And there are probably 2 key things we see here. So the first is how some leading companies are approaching the more traditional type of ongoing dialogue and engagement. Because this now tends to be driven by a genuine desire to understand and anticipate change in the business environment, whether that's around a specific issue or a set of issues, rather than being driven by social responsibility, it's moving quite a long way beyond the sort of dominant approach of conducting focused, time-bound consultations with a representative group of, let's say, investors, suppliers, business partners, maybe some of the more vocal NGOs, you know, those organizations that represent the company's most direct and visible stakeholders. Instead, leading companies are thinking a lot more holistically, what we like to call as consultant systems thinking. So they're purposefully analyzing the broader environment in which they operate, and they're gathering in diverse and sometimes very conflicting perspectives from a much wider range of stakeholders. So that's the first point. The second point in terms of the type of stakeholder is that actually when it comes to actively trying to collaborate and innovate, the need for, on the one hand, unusual partners and unusual partnerships, and on the other hand, more open source environments increases. So as you're trying to unpick and solve complex issues, it requires new types of interaction. And that's why today we see the likes of Unilever's Foundry as an example. So that's their platform that they use to identify and work with some of the world's best startups to accelerate business innovation around sustainability. So very different level and breadth of engagement and a very different set of stakeholders. The second big implication, and this follows on from the first, is the depth of engagement required. And again, there are probably two elements that we see most prominently. The first is that, probably understandably, as companies move to more intentional types of engagement, those that are seeking to address complex issues or unlock significant new opportunities for sustainable growth, then unsurprisingly, that requires much deeper engagement. Even just building consensus around that actually can be challenging in itself, but it certainly requires much deeper relationships. And the other side of the coin, of course, is that that also means that engagement skills need to become more deeply integrated in the business itself. And so that's another important aspect when it comes to the level of engagement. So for many companies, engagement remains a relatively peripheral exercise. Maybe it's managed by one team. Maybe that team has only a certain amount of resources allocated to it. In that context, it's difficult to build lasting trust-based relationships through a limited number of light touch engagements. But as companies move to different types of engagement, then actually those who need to be involved across the business change, and there's a much deeper need for skills within the organization. And Hannah's going to touch on that a little bit later. So those are some of the key implications. What are the benefits? And of course, the reality is the benefits are layered. The exact benefits will depend a lot on the specific focus and objectives of any particular engagement collaboration. But it's useful, I think, to codify these at a top line level. And what came out of the discussion at the forum in October were, I think, three core benefits, which we tried to sort of sum up here. The first is what we call collaborative advantage. And that is those targeted collaborations and engagements that as I mentioned previously, are either trying to drive transformation in key systemic challenges or open up new opportunities for growth. So that could include efforts to address supply chain labor issues. It could be about shifts in consumer behavior. It could be about enhancing the resilience of agricultural raw materials to climate change, right through to working with partners and customers to develop new types of sustainable product offering, whether that's products or servitized offerings. And if we think back to the 6 drivers that we presented at the start, this addresses 3 of them. The second benefit is what we call competitive agility. So this is about staying close to the pace of change by actually actively being part of the conversation, by engaging with a wide range of stakeholders and keeping track of different conversations. And as they play out, companies are better positioned to anticipate and influence that change. And it's important to note here that this doesn't necessarily just mean active engagement, it also means active listening. So for example, we work with a range of different clients, unsurprisingly on plastics a fair bit at the moment, using a range of different listening tools to help them track external sentiment and dialogue and conversation around specific issues. And that's equally important when it comes to this sort of competitive agility. And again, if we think back to the 6 drivers we presented, this sort of addresses 2 of them. So communication and connectivity, and then that shifting issues landscape. And then finally, the third is what we call reputational integrity. And this is really the result of the other 2. So if you get the other 2 right, this should naturally follow on. So it's the result, not the aim. And that's kind of the key shift that we've seen that I've alluded to in the last 15 minutes. So that's a bit about the more traditional and narrow forms of engagement, the drivers, and how this has resulted in a range of different approaches and resulted in a different sort of benefit to companies. I'm now just going to spend a little bit of time talking through some real world examples, and then I'm going to hand over to Hannah, and she's going to talk about some of the practical considerations to think about as you start on your journey. So the first thing we thought might be useful was just to list out some of the major types of engagement and collaboration that we're seeing at the moment. Now, of course, it's impossible to fully classify what is a very, very broad landscape. But this table shows some of the major types and some examples alongside them. And I'm just going to pick out a few. I'm not going to walk through everything here. The first, I think, is customer collaborations. And sometimes these manifest. And one of the companies at our forum was Philips. And they talked really eloquently about the changing relationship they have with hospitals, their healthcare business, as they move to more of a service model, and that service model being driven primarily by a need for a more circular economy. So sometimes they're one-on-one relationships, and sometimes they're more programmatic. And the example we've shared here is GE's Ecomagination 2020 Partnerships Program. And that's seen GE team up with 7 major business partners, customers, across 7 different industries to develop technology solutions that can help improve productivity, reduce impact, and increase returns in those different industries. Includes the likes of Statoil and Walmart, BHP, Billiton, Intel, etc. So for example, they're working with Walmart on accelerating the commercial adoption of energy efficiency and renewable energy. So not only is this part of GE's sustainability journey, it's also a very big business opportunity for them. So customer collaborations around sustainability, I think, are becoming deeper and more widespread. The second one I just want to pick up on is company-driven dialogues or forums, because this is actually something that quite a few companies will do. And in this case, Novo Nordisk and their Changing Diabetes program. So that's their response to the Global Diabetes Challenge. It sees them partnering up with patients, policymakers, healthcare professionals, NGOs, to address both risk factors and diagnosis and care around diabetes. But these sorts of company-led activities don't necessarily need to be this high profile. So for example, we're currently working with a number of different companies to help them undertake very targeted, intentional consultations around issues ranging from sustainable agriculture on one side right through to green public procurement. So that's definitely something that can be scaled depending on where you are in your journey. The other one I want to pick up on is policy advocacy initiatives. And this, I think, is a development that's come through in the last 2-3 years, and something that we see emerging more and more. And a couple of notable examples are the Ceres-led BICEP initiative, Business for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy, and also the more recently formed Sustainable Food Policy Alliance, which sees the likes of Mars and Nestle, and I think General Mills partnering up to actually advocate for more progressive policy around food in the US. So that's one example. And then another one I would just pick out, which many of you probably be more familiar with, are company advisory boards. So Shell probably has the longest running of these, whereby a group of external stakeholders provide both an independent annual statement and a dialogue with the senior leaders at Shell every year. And these are emerging in an increasingly wide range of forms, sometimes around issues, sometimes more centered on strategy, sometimes centered around the development of a strategy. And if they're done well and with commitment, they can be a really important tool in creating an open channel of outside-in dialogue and challenge into high levels within the business. So I think innovation in that space has been ongoing for some time. That's probably all the ones I will talk through there. I will touch briefly, just before we move on cross-industry partnerships. I'm going to talk in a second about Scania. They've recently developed a partnership with H&M, E.ON, and Siemens, so 4 companies from different sectors, but across the commercial transport value chain. So again, companies clustering around specific value chains, albeit from different industries, is again something that we're seeing more and more of. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I'm going to be handing it over to Hannah in a sec, but I just wanted to talk you through a couple of examples from the companies who presented at our forum. The first of these is Scania, They're obviously a commercial transport company. They manufacture both trucks and buses, and they provide a wide range of support services across transport and logistics. They're also a long-term client of Salterbaxter's. So this is obviously a sector that's experiencing significant disruption, both global sustainability drivers from urbanization and digitalization, and in particular the growth of urban centers, and also industry trends from automation, connectivity and electrification, but also biofuels. And that's really starting to now play out in policy. So as some of you will have seen, there have been some pretty major statements from countries and cities around the world around phasing out combustion engines. But at the same time, a lot of transport companies, Scania's clients, are starting to feel a lot of pressure from transport buyers across a whole range of industries, everyone from Walmart to Coke, people who buy transportation services as they set their own ambitions and need to follow that through. So given the breadth of technology solutions emerging and the fact that ultimately this needs to be developed in parallel with the infrastructure and energy sectors, that means Scania today is pursuing a very ambitious engagement and collaboration strategy. And in an industry perhaps where that is really becoming quite a key skill in terms of success. And so I just wanted to briefly share with you this model, and you'll be able to read a little bit more about this in the Scania 2017 report, because we work with them to help them, I guess, define a model for their engagement and collaboration efforts, to really try and help them think through what are the different types of engagement and collaboration, and how do they support both our driving the shift vision and our key focus areas around R&D. And so this model has two axes. On the one hand, on the right-hand side, on the horizontal axis, you have the far-reaching innovations that are a long way down the pipeline. And on the left-hand side, those here and now solutions that are market-ready. And then on the vertical axis, you have engagements and collaborations at the top that are much more system level, and at the bottom that are much more on-the-ground, practical implementation, commercialization focused. And we help them to basically define what each of those is. So down on the bottom left, you have industry partnerships, so where they're working with partners and customers to scale existing solutions right now, actually in existence, in order for them to start having an impact. On the top left, you have more what they call targeted shifts. So these are specific parts of the system where they're trialing new types of infrastructure. So an amazing project with the city of Galway and Siemens, where they've actually developed an e-highway, an electrical highway, where buses can tap into electricity from the grid. Then on the bottom right, these are far-reaching innovations that are further down the track, so working around hydrogen fuel trucks and other breakthrough innovations. And then on the top right, you've got really systemic, long-term, multi-stakeholder groups that they're working with to create a more effective framework for sustainable transport. And so this model or variants of it are a really useful way, I think, to test both existing partnerships and collaborations and to ask, do these fit within our scope of reference? Are they being effective? Are they actually helping us to achieve our objectives? But then also identifying where gaps might be. So increasingly, I think companies are starting to model and try and understand what their existing engagements and collaborations are driving towards, and whether any need to be sunset, and whether they need to develop new ones. Final slide for me is on Philips, another company that presented at our forum, and very eloquently, I think. And one of the initiatives they spoke about was their platform for accelerating circular economy. Philips produces a range of high capital value products, in particular their healthcare division. I mentioned that earlier. So think MRI scanners. And it's pursuing a strategy that sees it moving from the sale of that as a product to the provision of that as a service. So providing that as a service to the hospitals that they work with and the other healthcare institutions they work with. And that means that the ownership of those capital assets in many cases shifting to Philips. So there's a very clear incentive for the company to increase the circularity of the different components and materials within those products because they bear the cost. And so this is where the platform for accelerating the circular economy comes in. It's led by the WEF Forum and brings together public and private players across a number of different thematic areas with the aim of developing through policy, technology and finance solutions an acceleration of circularity in a number of different industries. And one of those is called Closing the Loop on Capital Equipment. And although it's early days, we thought it was worth sharing because this is a really interesting innovation when it comes to collaboration and engagement, in that the centering of companies around a particular challenge, in this instance, high value capital goods, is bringing together companies from a whole different range of industries under a public-private platform. So that was another really interesting example, and do follow up and have a look at the work of PACE if you have a chance. So I'm now going to hand over to Hannah, who's going to take a step back and focus in on some of the practical considerations.
Wonderful, thank you, Hugh. And just a quick reminder, if you guys do have any questions, please do ask them in the Q&A function, and we will get to them at the end of our slides. I'm only going to take a few minutes to run you through the next section, so please do share some questions as you see fit. So starting out on the journey, and now we've returned to this slide because I think it's a really important slide and a good reminder of the fact that in reality, the tactics of stakeholder engagement don't often change. I think we saw from the toolbox of solutions, there are a variety of different things that businesses are doing. Broadly speaking, they can be the same, whatever category that you're sitting in, when it comes to the different approaches on the screen at the moment. I think the key thing to remember, though, and the bit that makes the difference, is what is the company intention behind it, what is their focus, and what is it that they're looking to achieve. So the tactics may remain the same, but it's the intention that changes, and that's the really important bit when it comes to stakeholder engagement. So it's really the mindset of the organization and the people within it that drives the change. So the businesses that we've mentioned already in some of the examples that Hugh shared, but also the other panelists that we had in our event, through the insights that they shared and our own experience through this practice of stakeholder engagement, we are seeing some key behaviors emerging. So obviously, you know, a different intention to stakeholder engagement, a more considered approach of how you deliver returns on that engagement generates new behaviors. So some of the things that we're seeing is this move towards a sort of values-based discussion. So some of the areas that Hugh mentioned in terms of bringing together often conflicting opinions, different opinions, perhaps cross-sector, cross-audience. What that requires from people is that it can no longer be about two sides. It can no longer be about persuading people of your point of view. It has to be about what are the common values that we have. What are the things that we're trying to solve, and how can we find common ground within that? And we're seeing that real shift happening in a number of our clients, often the clients who perhaps come from a more scientific background or an engineering background, and actually who find those values-based discussions quite difficult. The other things that we're seeing is a much more sort of systematic analysis of your landscape. So obviously we mentioned about moving from sort of, you know, high level to deep and challenging, but it really is about taking a systems view of your issues in your operating environment and thinking, okay, who are the people that we need to talk to within that? How do we unlock the profitable partnerships? And some of that sort of analysis of your landscape, we believe, is really where bringing that knowledge into the business is where you begin to change the mindset within. Another thing that we're seeing, which I think is a challenge for many businesses, and requires a huge level of sort of bravery and leadership that is often challenging for sort of high level senior leaders, is this willingness to change the goal of the system. So obviously, normally the role that a business plays and what it wants to achieve is entrenched within a business. Thinking outside the box, thinking a little bit more around what are the challenges and the trends that we're facing at the moment. How is it that our business is going to be viable in 20 years' time? And how do we begin to transform it so that the goals of what our business is trying to achieve change alongside it? Always on learning. So this idea of agility is really important with a new sort of approach to stakeholder engagement. So whatever tactic you use, whether that is social listening, traditional engagement tactics, or multi-stakeholder forums, the always on learning point is really important. So how do businesses ensure that they're bringing those stakeholder voices inside, they're keeping them inside the business, they're using them to drive insight and innovation and collaboration? And that always on learning takes a huge amount of effort. But the ones that are really reaping the benefits and the rewards of it are the ones that are taking that approach. Negotiation skills are an absolute must. It's quite, when thinking about stakeholder engagement, I don't think we necessarily think about negotiation, but absolutely knowing when you're going into conversations and dialogue with stakeholders, knowing what the business can move on and knowing what it can't can really help facilitate sort of productive and progressive conversation with partners. Some of that is perhaps when you are later down the line in some of your collaborations, but even from the outset when you're thinking about finding common ground, what is it that you are willing to move on? And being open to change. So very often difficult with sort of, culture of short-term business planning, but knowing that, agendas evolve, issues evolve. We've seen it with plastics this year, suddenly, moving up the agenda at a rate that perhaps, a lot of us didn't predict 12 months ago. So how do you make sure that you can be agile in your stakeholder engagement and agile in your relationships with stakeholders? So being open to that change, being open to the business position changing, being open to that innovation are all behaviours that need to be encouraged within a business to really begin to continue to get the return on stakeholder engagement. So ways to get started, and I suppose this is the more practical bit. So one of the things that we were very keen to do at our forum, and we always try to do, is get the balance right between the sort of the theory and the thinking with some of the more practical ways that businesses can begin to implement things. We are very much about action here at Salterbaxter. We don't want to just stick with the theory. We want to give you ways in which you can begin to drive change within your own businesses. So some of the things that we learnt on the day, and obviously we know through our work, is to start narrow and identify hotspots. So this is really about being absolutely rigorous in the way that you map your landscape. So really understanding the different value chains, the actors, the drivers, the barriers, the innovations, the possibilities that are open within an issue landscape, and using that to spot the interventions. Often the interventions to drive real change are not where you think that they're going to be. Obviously you can do this on your own as an organisation. It works significantly better when you bring others in. So this can be a very good tactic in terms of how do you start off engagement with stakeholders? How do you start off a new conversation perhaps, which is less about informing what you're doing or consulting on a specific issue, but how do you begin to be quite active with your stakeholders? And systems mapping is a really good opportunity to do that. We did it as a part of the event. We took plastics again as a sort of a way to teach some of the people who attended what it looks like to sort of map your system. I think it's also really important to remember when you're thinking about this or starting on the journey, it doesn't always have to be the most high profile issue. You can use this process in itself to change the business within the mindset. And we're seeing many clients take something that is quite discreet, going through quite a rigorous process of systems mapping and using that information to change the mindset within the business and to create the business case for more ambitious action. So the second thing that we're seeing, and we've now mentioned this a couple of times, but it is so important to find the common ground with your stakeholders, and we use this model a lot. Often we find that where some of the conflict happens is when you're just debating about difference and you're staying at the surface. This is obviously normally where we see the most inflexible positions, where it is about one side thinks one thing and the other thinks something else. As we move down in the model, I think it gets much more profitable when businesses and stakeholders start thinking about the need. And some of this is just about defining the question that you're trying to answer. So often we see clients come at it from this is what we make. We want to talk about our product. We want to talk about the thing that we want to change within our business. By taking a more systemic and outside perspective on that, you begin to identify the breakthrough questions that all stakeholders can convene around, even the ones that wouldn't necessarily normally work together. Because focusing on the need is something that everybody wants to find solutions to, whether that's in ag chemicals or energy or other businesses with big challenges. So finding that common ground is where you'll most likely have the most constructive and profitable conversations. I think another really key part of that, and something that we've learned through both the event and our own work, is don't just think externally. Internally is often just as important when thinking about stakeholder engagement as externally. Some of the processes that we've been through with clients is taking a very similar process as you would map your external system to mapping your internal system. So really understanding the nested relationships that exist within your business. What is the level of understanding and maturity of each, and how do you create an internal engagement process that runs alongside your external engagement processes that deliver the required willingness, ambition, and effort to deliver on stakeholder expectations. Making sure that you can bring your business along on that journey, making sure that leadership is ready to listen and understand to the insight that you've gathered, is absolutely crucial if you're going to maintain good relationships with stakeholders. So our advice is always, if you're going to map your external system, map your internal system at the same time, see where there are crossovers, see where different interventions need to happen at different points so that you can achieve your aims. And the fourth and final thing is build the right skills and hold the relationships in the right place. So it may seem simple, but values-based discussions, negotiation, sort of robust facilitation skills are often skills that are not widely available within organizations, and they're absolutely crucial to profitable stakeholder collaboration and engagement. So really being very clear about where your organization perhaps lacks some of those skills, where do you need to build them? It is often at a leadership level. And then also making sure that the relationships that you're building are being held in the right place, and there is no one size fits all to that. Some relationships benefit from being held centrally. Some initiatives require that. Others, it is about pushing those relationships into the business, and we're seeing quite a few, such as the likes of H&M and others, actually adapting their HR model and the way that they recruit to build those required skills into recruitment, to build that into their training models, so that you have functional roles within the business that can hold on to those relationships for you. So it doesn't always have to be held at a central level, and often we see the most successful engagement taking place within those more functional roles. So those are just sort of four very sort of quick ways really to get started on stakeholder engagement and to sort of reap the returns of a more intentional approach. I hope you've enjoyed listening. If anyone's got any questions.
Yeah, not huge number of questions. I can see one that's come in, and again, it kind of builds, I think, on the point that you've made. So, how do we take that first step? How do we build the business case for this more intentional approach is the basic thrust of the question. And I think, to Hannah's point, I think is one thing that we find is that when companies really start to analyze their system, even if that's just one part of their system, and also consult around that, maybe have conversations, whether that's through existing multi-stakeholder initiatives that you're part of, or whether that's through a more formal process of consultation. And again, that doesn't have to be a big exercise. And actually through using active listening tools as well. What starts to surface is a much more profound business case and a much more nuanced business case and a more holistic one. And also through that process, it tends to surface initial thoughts on the role that you can play and who and how you can engage with. So I think that's the first point, is actually get out there and have the conversations, map the system, understand the issue and analyze the issues in more detail. That tends to serve as a much more profound business case. And then also start narrow, and sometimes be tactical. So, what are the key issues or issue where there's a real business imperative or need, and use that as a way into a different sort of approach. And then also think very carefully about, often the big challenge here is that many of these deliver benefits over the long term. So how do you square that with the need to build momentum and demonstrate short-term gains for the business? And so thinking hard on that and thinking how you can start to demonstrate impact as soon as possible is also important. Okay, I think that's it in terms of questions. We can see a lot of you are still on the line, so I hope you've enjoyed listening to what we've got to say. Please do follow up directly to me and Hannah. You can see our details on the screen there, or get in touch with Salterbaxter if you have anything else that you want to discuss. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure presenting to you today, and we wish you all well for today and the weekend, and yeah, hope to speak soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.